Okay, good morning, Dad. Today is Wednesday, November 20th, and yesterday was actually a pretty big day, even though I think many people didn't really think about it as a big day, because yesterday was the first time ever that US operated missiles were fired directly into undisputed Russian territory. So this is a momentous day in my opinion, but not in a good way. So there were six attack missiles that were fired into Russia's Bryansk region. From my understanding, five were intercepted. One was partially intercepted, damaged, and hit an ammunition depot, but didn't cause any damage. Just a small fire is what the Russians are reporting. That's what I heard. Do you have anything to add to that? What is your take on what happened?
Okay, well, the Americans have a different version of the incident. They say that eight missiles were fired and two were intercepted, and the other six hit the ammunition depot. We'll find out. I tend to believe the Russians, but we can't be sure. They may be deliberately downplaying it because they don't want to escalate. We'll know eventually because satellite photos will come out. There was some video footage on the internet um, that was supposedly showed the impact of missiles on this ammunition depot. But a number of people came out and said that, oh, no, this is actually old footage from a couple years ago. Again, I don't know. I can't verify that. Either interpretation. But in any case, actually, it shows some impacts, but it doesn't show the kind of explosions that you would expect from an ammunition depot. I mean, usually those explosions are huge, including mushroom clouds. And then this ammunition depot, whether or not it was hit, was a relatively small one that had apparently just old Soviet ammunition. So it was not it's not what you would call a high value target in any case. Anyway, we'll see. It looks like, again, I think probably the Russian version is true, and no damage was done. Yet it was a momentous incident. Even though there wasn't any damage done, the target was not a high value target. It was the first time that NATO has directly attacked Russia. That's what the Russians have been pointing out all the time. It just doesn't seem to filter through in the Western media. They just never talk about this because they don't never pay any attention to what the Russians are saying. But the Russians have been saying this repeatedly, and nobody has denied it. And in fact, some important Western officials have admitted that what the Russians are saying is true. But it doesn't seem to ever get into the Western media coverage of this. So somebody who's just consuming the establishment Western media would think that, for some reason the West was imposing very unreasonable restrictions on the use of these missiles. They were giving these missiles to the Ukrainians, but not letting them use it. Meanwhile, the Russians are firing missiles into their territory,
Right.
and when you look at it in that way, you say, yeah, why not? They should be able to fight back, right?
Right. Let
And,
Ukraine strike back. That's what I keep seeing online. Let
Yeah,
Ukraine
right.
strike back.
And to that extent, but the problem is that it's not the Ukrainians. These missiles have to be fired with direct NATO participation. We have to have, again, NATO technicians inputting the data, programming it. And that makes all the difference. And that's why this is a very alarming incident. And we'll have to see what the Russians, how they're going to respond. Now, there's been, I think, quite a bit of a very strong response within the Russian media. So, they have said, yeah, NATO is now, these are kind of the blaring headlines. These are the lead stories on the news shows. So the Russians, understand what's going on, and undoubtedly there's going to be pressure on Putin to respond. And Putin himself has made it real clear that this is serious. He's repeated this several times, as have other very high-ranking Russian officials. So it seems like likely, even though there was basically no damage done, if the Russian version is right, it seems likely that there will be some kind of response. Now, it'll be proportionate, since they didn't like attack the Kremlin or something. They're not going to go ahead and attack the White House. it could be, as we said, they'll give some missiles to the Houthis. Maybe they'll strike an ammunition depot somewhere in Romania or Poland.
Do you think they would do
tit
that?
for tat. They might. I just don't know. But that would be a tit for tat response, right?
Right, but I think Putin knows that if he does that, then that's what almost I think a lot of the people in charge in the West want. They want to be able to enact Article 5. That's what Zelensky wants.
Yeah, well,
Zelensky
the thing is, you can't, if it's Article 5 is, well, first of all, the members of NATO have to vote on it. It's not something automatic. And second, it is about an unprovoked attack.
Right.
But if NATO or a NATO country goes ahead and attacks Russia and then Russia responds, Article 5 should not be relevant in that case. Of course, they can always spin things and pretend. But, it's a difficult situation for Putin because, this is actually quite minor. He doesn't want to escalate. Yet, the thing is that the U.S. keeps on escalating. It's just sort of like the situation Iran is in the Middle East. We don't want to have a war, but if we don't respond at some point, they will just keep on going up the escalation ladder. It's going to get worse and worse. So at some point, we just have to respond. And, I'm sure that, I'm not sure, again, because it was a very minor incident, apparently. And it was also carried out under a lame duck administration. Biden's on his way out. And Trump it seems from things that he said and other people around him said that they will probably put an end to this policy when Trump takes office. So, given that situation, especially if Trump contacts or, the Trump team contacts the Russian government directly and says, hey, we're going to, when we take office, when we're in charge, this won't happen. I'm sorry, this is happening now. It may be enough for the Russians just to ignore it as long as there's no, significant damage. We'll see.
Or if we may just continue to escalate. I mean, we did this quick. The news that the U.S. gave permission, and then within 24 hours they did it. They had it all lined up, ready to go.
Yeah.
So
and then I actually heard just 2 hours ago, 12. This is the news story that 12 Storm Shadow missiles were fired at a village in Kursk, in the Kursk region.
Oh, really?
And then, according to the Russians, all 12 were intercepted. And you can even see there's a video of some guy, in Kursk, he's filming these storm shadows flying over one after another.
Yeah. Well, an exciting time for people living in Kursk. It sounds like a pretty boring place until recently.
Yeah.
So,
right.
What is does most of the world view it the way that we see it, or the way the Russians see it, that this is NATO attacking Russia? Or
I think most of the world views it that way. Yeah, I mean, it's in the West. We live in this bubble, where we are just hidden really from the truth. I go and I look at the mainstream news feed every day, and it's basically just Ukrainian propaganda. It's just spoon-fed to the Western media, and then they regurgitate it. That's all it is. And they never listen to what the Russians say, because that would be, collaborating with the enemy or something. But it's, what kind of news coverage is that? You gotta, what are the Russians saying? It's very important. And of course, the Russians have been saying that this would be a direct attack because, this cannot be done by the Ukrainians on their own. That's a huge point. Well, if you're a true, responsible Western journalist, you should look into that. But none of them do. None of them even bother to hear what the Russians have to say. If they look into it, they would see that their own people, like Olaf Scholz, those German generals, just to give one example, the ones that were caught on that on that tape discussing the use of the Taurus missiles on the Kerch Bridge, they said openly that, we can't do this, by ourselves. The NATO has to fire these missiles.
Okay, so most of the world, you think, is aware of that this is a NATO attack
I
on
think
Russia.
so. I think that's how most of the world looks at it.
Right, but I think,
and that's kind of like much of the world, especially the global South, has kind of become increasingly pro-Russian because they look at NATO as sort of the alliance of the colonial powers.
Right.
and so they kind of naturally find themselves rooting for Russia. For Russia is the one country that can take them on.
Right. Well, I think it's more important what the people in these Western countries, within NATO countries, believe. But
Yeah.
I think that within the NATO countries, most of them believe that this is just Ukraine now having the ability to strike back, that these were restrictions that should have been lifted a long time ago.
Yeah,
Is that true?
Because they never get, they never hear the other side of the story. They never hear the essential fact, the Russian argument, which again is supported, very powerfully by the evidence. In fact, nobody's really denying it on the Western side, but
Right.
that information is suppressed. So most Western Europeans just don't understand.
Right.
No,
So
quite a few Western governments actually are against this policies, or some important ones are, like Germany has come out. Olaf Scholz once again came out and said, we don't support this. We think this is a mistake. And apparently Meloni of Italy also said the same thing just the other day.
Right. But the issue is that if people in the NATO countries, they don't believe that this is really a NATO attack on Russia. If Russia does strike, let's say, like you said, did a tit for tat, struck a base in Romania, then people will say that this is an unprovoked attack, that this is an aggression. It will be easier to push Article 5 through.
It's easier, but I think it's also going to be, I don't think there's a real appetite for, direct war with Russia. I think it's just the foolishness. Again, it's just these idiots, they're just not looking at the consequences, and they feel like they can get away with anything. Again, it seems like a lot of these Western leaders have made the assumption that Russia today is essentially Russia of the 1990s, and just won't dare to take us on. I mean, this is the kind of thinking that they've had all along, and it's really what's gotten them into such big trouble. I think, first of all, they basically tore up the Minsk agreements, just ignored it. It just, Russia's been, before the invasion in 2022, Russia was continually ringing the alarm bells and saying, "Hey, we got a real problem here. We got to solve this," and they just blew them off, right? And then ended up with a war on their hands. But they still really have not learned. It seems like this is still their idea, is that basically, because when they talk about, for example, when Western media talks about some sort of ceasefire, it's clear that they never bothered to talk to look at what the Russian demands are. They just kind of figure that we can impose a ceasefire, and they'll just have to accept. They'll be happy, which is just nonsense. They don't understand, that Russia is a sovereign power and is actually more powerful than they are on the battlefield. I don't think they really get it yet.
Right.
So they're just thinking we can do this. First of all, they're idiots. They think that this actually is going to make a difference. And, it'll have no effect on the outcome, which again, actually, like the Pentagon has been saying, is still saying. They imagine that it really could have an effect, just like every other system. Think about the F-16s. We mentioned, these missiles, but then, there was a huge, hullabaloo about the F-16s. There were cries and systems. We got to bring in the F-16. That'll turn things around. Well, they were delivered some months ago, and what have you heard about F-16s?
Right.
Nothing, right? We know at least one, probably more, but at least one either crashed. That's what the Ukrainians said, or was shot down.
Shot down by, I think you said that, potentially by our own Patriot interceptor.
Yeah, well, that's a possibility. There are different stories. There are different versions. And then there's also reason to believe that some other F-16s were actually destroyed on the ground. But in any case, we're just not seeing F-16s. We don't hear about them. Obviously, they're just not having, if there are any F-16s left, they're not having an impact, just like all these other systems.
Right.
So, anyway, it's just like but they don't seem to get it. There's this, abiding faith in Western superiority. And I think it parallels, it's very much analogous to the faith in Israeli, Jewish Israeli superiority in the Middle East. Actually, I was hearing, it was very interesting. I can't remember, maybe it was Alistair McCrook, right? Alistair Crook, not McCrook.
Alistair Crook.
Alistair Crook, right.
Mixed up Alexander Mercouris with Alexander Crook, yeah.
But he was saying, like prior to October 7th, actually there was a lot of intelligence coming in saying, hey, they're planning a major attack. They're planning to breach the border, and actually make an incursion into Israeli territory. And people like Netanyahu and whatever, they saw this, but it's just that they had such a, they believe so strongly in Israeli superiority, in Arab inferiority, Arab incompetence, Israeli invincibility, that they always just shrugged it off and said, they can't do that, And so they just weren't worried about it, and they didn't make any special preparations. It's sort of the same thing that we're seeing. It's just like the West still can't get its head, wrapped around the fact that Russia is a very formidable opponent. And in fact, they're superior on the battlefield. I think they still can't get it.
It's a very dangerous mentality to have, though, because it gives this idea that you can just continually escalate with impunity. And like you said, eventually they will be forced to respond. And I think that's what, he's saying Putin is in this situation. It's a tough situation. He obviously doesn't want to escalate, but he knows that if he doesn't, they'll just say, look, we told you Russia's a pushover. They never do anything. Their red lines are just, green lights. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Just keep going. Yeah. And so it just feels like, how dangerous is this situation now? I feel like Putin will have to respond. And we're playing with potential nuclear war at this point.
Yeah.
If we
I think that's actually ladder. That's I don't want to discount that entirely, but I think that's highly unlikely, and I can't remember
too,
when
but
I think but
I
still any chance, of course. The thing is, like, if in fact these Westerners were right and that we could defeat Russia, that's where you have the chance of nuclear war. Like, as if Russia was losing the war, and there was a chance that a NATO army or a Ukrainian army can march on Moscow, it's at that point where Russia might resort to nuclear weapons. So if, like, all this fevered talk that you hear by Ukrainian leaders and Baltic presidents and the Polish prime minister, whatever, if any of that was true, because they talk like that, we need to, we got to defeat Russia on the battlefield, we've got to bring about the disintegration of Russia. If their dreams actually were realized, then we could have a nuclear war on their hand. Fortunately, they're completely nuts, and they just don't. It's not going to happen. I don't think we're going to get even close to that. It's just that Russia is winning. There's no way that Russia's going to lose, and so therefore, I think the risk of nuclear war it's not zero, but I think it's very low in this case. Maybe the greater risk is that there would be some sort of miscalculation. One side or the other could misread something that's happening, thinking that, an incoming missile is a nuclear missile or something, and respond accordingly. There's, again, that happened in the Cold War. We had some really close calls. Again, I think it's much more likely that a nuclear weapon will be used first in the Middle East, by Israel.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to see, of course, nuclear war happening right away. But once these things can snowball and get out of control real quickly. And just what we've seen, if I asked you a year ago, do you think that NATO would ever fire missiles into Russia directly? You would probably have been like, no way, they're not that stupid. They're not going to do that, right? I mean, but everything we've seen is that we just keep on crossing our own red lines. These aren't Russia's red lines so much.
Yeah, well, this last one is a Russian red line.
Okay, right. This last one
the
is
thing
for
is,
sure,
they have gone out and they've, it's not just once or twice, but several times. Lavrov, Putin, Peskov, they've all said this, and so so I think they may feel like they just have to respond. Even though this was a minor incident, most likely. I think they feel they have to respond in some way. I think they'll try to make it proportionate. For example, they may target, again, an ammunition depot of similar size in NATO territory. That's just a possibility.
That's scary to me.
It is scary. But I mean, whatever, what can you do? But then also, you give ship-killing missiles to the Houthis, and if they take out an aircraft carrier, that's even scarier in a way. I mean, that's going to be such a huge blow to the U.S. prestige. I mean, what...
It's all scary. But basically you're saying that Putin is going to have to take a scary option. I'm not so much worried about the Russians starting firing nukes. I'm just worried about how the U.S. and NATO responds, because they just have to, keep this aura of invincibility, NATO, the greatest force in the world, and they can't be humiliated, and they are being humiliated. So it's just this very unpleasant thing to witness, and it's very dangerous as well. Just this denial of the reality, and they're potentially playing with the lives of everybody on this planet. The kids, they keep on going down. And I guess my question is just, how can this war be stopped? How can we slow things down? Because one thing I've kind of learned just talking with you is these wars, conflicts, they build up a certain amount of inertia and momentum. And once they get moving, it can be really hard to just stop and slow it down. And so everything we've seen over the past 2 years is that these conflicts don't cool down. They escalate, and there are more parties getting involved, more advanced weapon systems. It's all building up. And unless there's something to pull us back from the brink, it sounds like nuclear war is far away now, but the way things are going, if we don't change course 1 year, 2 years from now, bunker sales are going to be going through the roof, right? And so how do we stop this? How do we slow things down?
Right. Well, I don't really, I was just thinking about it. I think our best hope is actually a major breakthrough by the Russians during the next 2 months prior to Trump's inauguration. See, I know that Trump wants to pull out of this war, but it would be hard for him to do so. Because, again, look at Afghanistan. That was a public relations disaster for Biden, right? The way that ended. And Trump doesn't want to have anything similar happen to him in Ukraine. If he, for example, he says, not another penny to Ukraine, and then a few months later, Ukraine just truly collapses all along the front line, and, it'll all be pinned on him. He says, Biden stood by Ukraine, but Trump abandoned it, and look what happened. Right. And it makes us look weak. We didn't keep our promise to our ally, and now, Taiwan and whatever, how can they believe in us? These are the sort of things that they will say, and they are already saying. But if Russia manages to achieve a major breakthrough before Trump takes office, I think that there will be a lot less pressure on him. They won't be able to pin it all on him. They say, look, the breakthrough, the collapse occurred while Biden was in charge. So clearly what he was doing did not work. So this is actually my biggest hope. There is a lot of talk, and there's reason to believe that the Russians may have a couple of major offensives planned. One in the south and one in the north. In the south, we're talking about Zaporozhye. Recently they've made some moves, and they apparently have 100,000 soldiers in reserve there that are not even on the battle lines, but they could be put in there at any time. And then up in the north, I think it would be around, not in Kursk, but it's the next oblast over, just north of Kiev. There's supposedly have 50,000 soldiers there, and they could begin an offensive quite easily. They've, recently, I think they've done some kind of reconnaissance in force, is what they call it. They've gone in and captured a few villages and held them for a while and came back. It seems like they may be getting ready for something. So, if these offenses begin in the near future, and probably, when the ground gets hard, so we're talking about with like a couple weeks from now, and, they'll just put overwhelming, already, the Ukrainian defenses are crumbling. They just cannot withstand the pressure. This would increase the pressure significantly on the front line, and I think it really could cause a total collapse of Ukrainian defenses. And if that happens, it's just the sort of thing that cannot be hidden. The way that these Russian victories recently have just been hidden from the Western public. I know because I read that news all the time. You just wouldn't know that Russia is taking, town after town and is on the verge of capturing some major cities. You wouldn't know any of that. But if there's a total collapse and they just go marching towards the Dnieper, that cannot be hidden. And if it happens before January 20th, I think that puts Trump in a much stronger position to just pull out of the war and say, look, it didn't work. all this, that $180 billion that we sent to Ukraine. Look, that's what it got us. You want me to send another 180 billion? What's the point? I think he will really strengthen his position vis-a-vis the public and the media.
Do you think Putin is aware of that? Do you think the Kremlin?
It's hard to believe that he's not.
Right.
So it may be. I'm guessing. Again, he's got a lot more information than I do, but it just seems like there's a convergence of factors that would support, a major push by the Russians in the next few weeks. And it's, first of all, the change of administrations, but then also the winter. Actually, winter is a better time to launch an offensive. The ground is hard and, can support heavy armor. And then, they have been building up these forces, over a period of time. They have them. They have at least 150,000 well-trained troops, ready to, that they can deploy to the front lines at a moment's notice. So it just looks like, this may be the time.
Okay. And right now as well, Ukraine's energy infrastructure is badly crippled. Do you think that will have a big effect during this winter?
Yeah.
Ukraine gets very cold.
Right. Yeah. I think they're doing this for different reasons. One, of course, the factories, the ones that still exist in Ukraine, depend on that electricity, of course. The weapons factories, but then also more importantly is logistics. The trains, all the trains depend on electricity too. So that's how you move troops around and you send equipment to the front line. If you deprive the rail system of electricity, then that greatly impedes Ukrainian logistics. And then, maybe also just like turning the lights off in the cities, a place like Kharkov or something. It makes it easier for the Russians to take there's just very few civilians there. It will make it, I'm just guessing, but maybe that's another consideration of theirs.
Okay. Well, I hope you're right. That does sound like the best scenario if Russia makes a big push before Trump takes office, really causes the collapse and say, like, this is over, to end the bloodshed. No more money to this project.
Right.
Let's leave. But then the problem is though afterwards. What happens afterwards? Are we entering potentially into a new Cold War? And then
I'm afraid so. I don't think. In the end, I don't think we're going to get a negotiated settlement. That would be the ideal thing. Is that finally the Americans would come back to the negotiating table and say, all right, Russians, you were right. We should have listened to you back in 2021 and earlier. The Russians had been saying this for years. Well, okay, Ukraine's going to be neutral. We're going to demilitarize Ukraine. Just you don't need to worry about it, and let's bury the hatchet. That would obviously be ideal. In the end, it would be the best thing for NATO and for Europe as well, but they just can't do that. I just don't think I think there's just no way that they can, even if there are certain enlightened leaders in the West that could, like Orban, maybe and a few people within the Trump administration, and just overall the political class in the West just would not. They just could not swallow that. It just would be too great a humiliation for them. So I think we're not going to see a negotiated settlement. In the end, there will be a frozen conflict, but it will be on Russia's terms. They'll decide what territory they have to take. And in the absence of negotiations, I think they're going to see the need to take like all of southern Ukraine, including Odessa.
But the Western Ukraine, that's the anti-Russian part. That's the part that really needs to be.
The thing is, right. I know some people like Mark Sloboda thinks that they're probably going to go all the way through and conquer all of Ukraine and subjugate Western Ukraine. And he might be right, but I think they would, first of all, be very reluctant to do that because they know that they would have a real headache. These people are going to fight to the end. Even when they've been defeated on the battlefield, they're going to be carrying out assassinations and whatever. Because there's true anti-Russian hatred in Western Ukraine. That's where the ultranationalists come from. The rest of the country, certainly like the south and the east. So we're talking about Kharkov and Odessa. These places are really very strongly Russian leading, and I think they would, the majority of citizens would be very happy to see the Russians come in, and so governing these areas is not going to be very difficult. Yeah, but governing Western Ukraine is going to be a real challenge, and I think they just may not want to take on that challenge. So you say, okay, yeah, we still have these crazies, these banderites, that are just dedicated to destroying Russia, but we basically defang them. They don't even have, once you take Odessa, they don't even have access to the Black Sea. And then you take in Eastern Ukraine, you've taken all the, really the most valuable land, all the industry. So they just end up being, actually a very poor and crippled rump state. Yeah, they'll be a pain in the what, but they really can't do much of anything. They will have essentially been neutered. And that's not the ideal outcome, but I think it's something that the Russians probably could live with.
Okay. Well, I saw a headline said that Kremlin will not allow for a frozen conflict.
Yeah, I think they're talking about now. There's no question but it'll be on their terms. When they get the territory that they feel they have to have in the absence of negotiations, they'll stop. That's my guess, anyway. That's
So
again,
okay.
I'm not privy to the conversations in the Kremlin, but I think that's probably what they're going to do.
Right. So the most likely outcome, as long as we avoid major escalation, there's no nuclear war, is that Russia will dictate the terms, and then we will enter into a new Cold War period, is what you think. And then essentially, just basing on the previous Cold War, what we'll see is this kind of an arms race, increased tensions and hostility, which is going to be an unpleasant period of time until eventually one side just collapses, which it seems to me clear that it'll be the Western side this time. The Western side that is overladen with debt, is fallen behind, is very corrupt and inefficient, is overly bureaucratic, and not moving part and plugging itself, integrating itself into this multipolar world that's being created. So is that kind of what you see is going to happen? Is that the Western nations?
Yeah, that's certainly possible. Yeah, it's also a question, though. It's just like how serious are the Western powers? Again, there's all this hysteria and all this heated rhetoric, but again, we haven't really seen, let's say, substantive actions to match that rhetoric. Meaning, there have been some minor increases in defense budgets. I think like the UK defense budget went from 2% to 2.5%. But I mean, they talk about as though the very existence of the UK were at stake and that they just have to fight off the great Russian threat. So the Russians are going to be marching, to Paris. And if they really believed that, you would think that they would do more than raise their defense budget to 2.5%. I mean, that's kind of what you see throughout the West. So I wonder, if they actually, in the end, they're defeated. There's all this talk about how, our Western Europe is, that we have a Hitler on our borders and Western Europe is threatened and whatever. But it's sort of like like what's happened here in this country. Remember all the very overheated rhetoric about Trump as Hitler, Trump as, a fascist who's going to bring about the death of democracy in this country. After he was elected, you still heard some of that, but a lot of those people just shut up. It's just like, okay, well, here's a new day. I guess that didn't work really. And I kind of wonder if that's the same thing you're going to find in Europe. And maybe that after the Russians win, that a lot of, that rhetoric, that hysteria may gradually die down and they just sort of might wake up as from a bad dream or something and start behaving in a more pragmatic fashion vis-a-vis Russia. That's just a possibility. What you said very well could be true too, though. I just don't know. We'll have to see because you see both forces at play in Europe.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, even, with Biden and the current administration saying people have changed their rhetoric with Trump, but I just feel like this action that Biden took was just so reckless and so stupid.
Yeah.
He's on his way out.
Yeah.
This war is clearly over. He's trying to just throw money into Ukraine while he still can. And
Right.
It sounds like maybe he's doing it just to attack Trump because in their mind, maybe they really believe that Trump is this existential threat. Trump is the biggest risk. And, there's a chance that we might have nuclear war, but it's still worth it to hurt Trump. That almost seems like the calculation that
it could be
this administration is making. And it seems it's so reckless and so stupid. And the excuse that they used about the North Koreans, it insults the intelligence, just how bad it is. So I'm just wondering, are Europeans following the Biden administration on this? It seems so poorly thought out.
Yeah.
So stupid.
Well, actually, a lot of the Europeans were upset with the Biden administration that he hadn't lifted the restrictions earlier. Right. And so now they're pleased, including not just, individual nations within the EU, but the EU Foreign Minister Borrell has been advocating lifting the restrictions, and he congratulated, Biden on the decision that he made. So they're very much, the leadership in Europe is very much, on the same wavelength. They look at the world the way the way that Biden does.
Okay, yeah, it's always hard for me to believe because when we have
I know it's hard to believe. Yeah, sometimes I'm always like, this is just so absurd. Obviously this has to be a joke or whatever. But again and again, I have to remind myself that this is the world that we live in now.
Right. If I try to put the shoe on the other foot and look at it. I don't know if this is a fair, correct analogy. You can just tell me if you think it's right. To me, it's almost like, think about how the U.S. would react if Russia overthrew the Canadian government and installed some far extremist French-Canadian government that hates everything English and hates the Americans most of all. And this new government bans speaking English in Canada. And then Russia starts pumping in missiles and weapons into Canada to attack the breakaway region of Nova Scotia that wants to join the United States or something like this, and then all of a sudden Russia gives long-range missiles, and they start shooting these missiles into Minnesota. Like, how would America react? That's
right.
Is that a crazy analogy?
Well, it's not entirely crazy. It's impossible to make a perfect analogy, but it's roughly correct. So the Russian reaction is actually very reasonable. As I was saying, that Russian media is in something of an uproar over this. Again, not much, apparently very little, if any, damage was done. But this was a direct attack by NATO on Russia. That is, momentous. That's huge. And they have every right to be, infuriated.
Right. Okay, it's scary. It's such a stupid move. I also saw that the Ukraine has fewer than 50 ATACMS missiles. Like, this is going to do nothing, nothing to
that's
Russia.
exactly, again, that's exactly what the Pentagon has been saying all along. For some reason, they can't talk about, Russia's point that this would be a NATO-operated, NATO-fired missiles. But they've said, they've just looked at the benefit side of it, and they said there's really no benefit to these missiles. It's just not going to make a difference. So, that's why that's how they explain their refusal to lift the restrictions earlier. Mm-hmm. But nothing has changed. They just came up, with the Korean excuse, and we talked about how ridiculous, that all is. Okay. By the way, just yesterday, the Pentagon spokeswoman Singh, I think, said that, in fact, they could not verify that there were any North Korean soldiers at the front lines.
Oh, okay, finally.
So overall, I think they started to kind of waver on that and go with, but it seems like there is still some integrity on some of these issues within the Pentagon.
No, okay.
But it hasn't slowed anybody down. It's just like, it's not just, you would think of, the tabloid press would just love, they love the North Korean story, but all the so-called serious press has just been behaving like tabloid press, and they just keep on going with it. They took this ball and they just keep on running with it, running the wrong way down the field. It's just really bizarre.
Okay, so then, fingers crossed, best case scenario, Putin waits it, doesn't do anything rash. He knows that a new president's coming in 2 months. Maybe tries not to do any major escalation. Maybe nothing even, potentially.
Possibly.
Who knows?
Yeah, especially, I think, especially if if the Trump team contacts him and says, "Hey, we're against this too. I'm sorry this happened. So please stay cool. When we take office, it'll end." I think if he gets a message like that, it'll be a lot easier for him not to do anything.
Right. But the other thing that we have to have our fingers crossed for and hope is that the Biden administration doesn't try to escalate even more. Say, hey, look, we could fire missiles into them. They didn't do anything. Let's give them more advanced ones. Let's give them the JSAMs. Let's hit them, even further.
Or the Tomahawks or something.
Right.
That's actually what Zelensky was asking for, the Tomahawks. And there's still all this pressure on Taurus. Schultz has remained firm on that. But that Metz would be a serious, because the Taurus has a range of 500 kilometers. It could it could strike anywhere in Moscow, for example. The ATACMS has only 300 kilometers, and it cannot reach Moscow.
Okay, well, let's fingers crossed that things don't escalate more, but the moves we're making are clearly intended to escalate. I think that's right. As escalatory as possible. Okay,
not as escalatory as possible. It seems like, because it's the approach of NATO has been described, as kind of a salami slicing tactic, meaning that you escalate in very small increments, and each increment is so small that the Russians, tend to say, well, that is hardly any difference. We don't need to respond. And that's the hope, I think, with this, is they say, okay, yeah, we're escalating, but we're going to escalate just limit it to the Kursk region, and only against certain kinds of targets. And
well, this wasn't even the Kursk region. This was the Bryansk region.
Right. It's a nearby region. That's correct. But yeah.
Yeah, I understand.
I think that's
they could do more. Obviously, they could.
Right.
They're
that's actually there's some right. They're exercising some caution, but it clearly is. Actually, as I think Putin put it, it changes the essence of the war. This is not, even if it is a small increment, even if the incident itself didn't cause any damage, it changes the essence of the war, because now this is not just a proxy war. This, NATO attacked Russia directly, and that is just a huge fact, that has to be dealt with.
But it doesn't feel that way to most people. Most people feel like
because they're just not right, because the coverage is terrible. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the Western journalists are just not doing their job. They're not explaining, what the Russian argument is, and they, they're not admitting actually the Russians are correct. There's just no question about it.
Okay, I'd like to move over to the Middle East just for a little bit before we wrap up. Okay. Just talk about the Houthis. I think the Houthis are just a fascinating story. That these are people that have been bombed into oblivion. They've been sanctioned, starved. They have nothing. They were just dirt poor people. The Saudi Arabia waged this horrific war against them, backed by the United States. Backed
by the U.S., that's right.
Right, and now they just seem to be getting more and more advanced, more and more sophisticated. It's an incredible story, in my opinion. It almost reminds me of, I was just thinking of Star Wars, like Obi-Wan, like
I know. Taking on the Empire, right?
Right, taking on the Empire.
It is, right.
Like just a ragtag bunch, so
right. They're remarkable. I mean, for their courage, their tenacity, and also their integrity. Mark Sloboda has described them as like the most moral fighting force on the planet, and I have to agree. I mean, it's just like they're doing this. This is actually for their brothers in Palestine, right? They're targeting Israeli-linked shipping in the Red Sea. And they're doing it again for their brothers in Palestine. And so you just have to take off your hats to them. They say this is really, it's honorable, it's remarkable, it's
commendable. It's
commendable, exactly.
It's impressive. Is there still a lot of animosity that the Houthis have for Saudi Arabia? I mean, they bombed them for years.
Yeah, well, that seems to have ended. Remember, of course, that back then there was this general rift between Shia and Sunnis, especially between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And in fact, like the war against Yemen carried out by Saudi Arabia, was an outgrowth of that. It was at that time Obama was sealing the deal, the JCPOA, between the West and Russia. Actually, they were involved in one of the parties to this, and Iran. Over the Iranian civilian nuclear program. But the Saudis were very upset about this. They didn't like it, just like Israel didn't like it, because this was a chance to bring Iran in from the cold and a chance to restore relations between Iran and the West. And so they expressed their displeasure. And to kind of buy off the Saudis, the Obama administration says, well, we'll support you in your war against Yemen. And so that's what happened. But now, again, that rift has been healed. And so a lot of that, that hostility, I think, that used to exist I'm sure that some of it remains. I think there's too much was done, too many lives were lost. But in general, Saudi Arabia has really has pulled back, has decided to smoke the peace pipe and not, conduct these wars against the Shia.
Okay. So can you tell me a little bit about just the Houthis' capabilities now? They seem to be getting more and more sophisticated. How are they getting more sophisticated? How does such a poor country...
I don't think they can develop them themselves. Maybe I'm wrong, but they just don't have the industrial base to do this. I don't think they do. I think they must be getting them from Iran and possibly from Russia too.
The missiles are coming straight from there,
missiles.
Do you think?
I think,
or components,
they may,
or...
Right, yeah, at least the components, and maybe they assembled them there in Yemen. But I have trouble believing that they can develop their own hypersonic missiles.
So,
I think that those.
Well, I saw a missile that they wrote hypersonic on. I'm like, did they just write that, or did they actually have a hypersonic?
I'm not sure. But they may. I believe the Iranians do have them, and maybe the Iranians supplied them with some.
Okay. Yeah, it's in a fascinating group, fascinating country, and I think that when this is all over, I think their actions are already kind of changing the makeup of the Middle East, just their influence, their power. It's like I said, it's just humiliating.
Well, this victory against the empire. I mean, I think it's a humiliation for the U.S., and I think much of the world is just standing in awe of them.
Yeah, it's really, really something. Okay, well, I kind of asked how, I'm going to end with this. I asked how we can stop the war in Russia, and you gave, I think, a good explanation, the best case scenario, if we can, Russia makes a big move soon and then puts Trump in a better position to stop this. But how can we stop Israel? How can Israel be stopped?
I don't think it can. I mean, I think it's just that Israel is firmly in the clutches of a genocidal, apocalyptic cult. I just don't think that's an exaggeration. The people that run Israel, and unfortunately with the support of the majority of the Israeli population, they are just hell-bent on achieving greater Israel and of actually knocking out their main rival, which is Iran. And I think they're not going to rest until that's achieved. Either that's achieved or they themselves are destroyed. I think that's what we're looking at.
That's how it's going to end.
Yeah.
I
think it's going to end with the defeat of Israel. I think that's how it's going to end. And of course it could go nuclear. Again, when their very existence is threatened, they may choose to exercise the nuclear option.
I've been thinking about this potential war with Iran, and the more I think about it, I just don't think that Trump would do it. It just doesn't seem like he would lose his base. He would wreck the global economy. Yeah. He would destroy, his reputation, his legacy, everything.
I'm not sure. Because there are opposing forces, I think, first within his inner circle, and look at his appointments. A lot of these people he appointed are extreme Zionists and extreme anti-Iran war hawks, and just unhinged in their hatred of Iran and their love of the Zionist vision. And then he himself, I think, there is the Trump that really doesn't like wars. But there's also the Trump that has sold his soul to Israel and is obsessed with overturning the Iranian regime, as he would call it. And it's just a question. I think there's a real risk that he will go in for, all-out war with Iran. I mean, you remember he tore up the JCPOA. He imposed, these extremely severe sanctions on Iran. He also ordered the execution of Soleimani. Now, he did stop. There were people who wanted him to go start bombing Iran after that, people like John Bolton, and he didn't go along with that. And he did accept like the Iranian retaliation and just, call it quits. So, I think you can find evidence for both possibilities. It may be that the sensible part of his brain wins out, but there is, he's also shown himself very vulnerable to this anti-Iranian, war, anti-Iranian rhetoric, and he's surrounded himself with a lot of these extremists on the issue.
Right. But I mean, if he does do this, I mean, we'll just enter a dark period, right? I mean, the global economy will turn upside down.
There's a real chance of it. Yeah.
I mean, gas will go $10 a gallon. Strait of
Right.
Hormuz is closed. I mean, then you're pulling in potentially Russia and China that will back Iran.
Yeah, I don't think they'll become involved directly, but they will support Iran. They'll supply them with weapons and economic, give them economic and military backing. Yeah, no question about it.
It's so suicidal. I really hope that it doesn't happen. But you really think that there's a pretty good chance?
I think there's a real possibility. Just look at those appointments. The kind of crazy stuff that these people say about Iran. And again, it's just that he's Trump. Again, he's always been, I think, more sensible in foreign policy than his opponents, both 2016 and then again now. But he's always had a bee in his bonnet about Iran. That for some reason he got convinced that Iran really is, the great Satan of the Middle East and needs to be taken out. And we'll see. But, maybe if we're like, it comes down to it and it's laid out before him, look, if we go this route, first of all, we may be humiliated. Our ships might be sunk, our bases might be destroyed. In fact, we're predicting that's what will happen. And then second, again, they can shut the Strait of Hormuz, the gas prices will double. That's going to be really bad for your approval ratings. And he may look at that and say, it's not worth it. I don't think he's a real warmonger. So when if he really understands the costs, he may just stop short. And maybe that's what he did, like after the Soleimani assassination. Horrible as that was, he did stop there. So we can hope, it's not like there's no hope here, but I think there's reason to be very fearful. I mean, because there's some, like the anti-Iran forces are going to be even strong in this upcoming administration will be stronger than they are in the Biden administration.
Well, if you're saying that Israel can't be stopped, that it's going to have to really, either be destroyed or they have to completely bring in the U.S. to completely destroy Iran and, to have a world set in chaos. Right. That's not going to work. So what is the best thing that we can hope for? That similar situation as in with Russia, that Iran deals a devastating blow to Israel sooner rather than later, maybe before Trump takes office, or is that just going to escalate things even more?
Yeah,
and just say that we really have to go to war.
I'm afraid, in this case, that's what's going to happen. I mean, the pressure on Trump to do something about it, just like it's going to be huge. It's just because the pro-Israel forces in this country are so powerful. And again, they're much more powerful than the pro-Ukraine forces. And so it would be hard for any administration to ignore that pressure. And then again, look at that administration is an expression of that same Zionist extremism.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. It's frustrating just watching this conflict, and there's no way to stop it. It's just you're gonna keep moving forward. It's been almost a month now since Israel tried to carry out its attack on
Right.
Iran, and Iran has promised retaliation.
Yeah.
Why is it taking so long? Do you think that there's something
Who
with
knows? I think they will, but again, it's just like I guess, have decided that there's just no reason to rush it. They'll do it at the time of their choosing. Again, it might be tomorrow, it might be a month from now. Who knows?
Okay. Okay, well then let's go ahead and end it there, Dad.
Okay.
All right. Have a good rest of your day.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.